Moving into a new house was supposed to be an exciting adventure. It was a fresh start, a place to call home, and the chance to turn a house into something uniquely theirs. For the young couple, this move felt like it was the beginning of something big, something perfect. They had found a house that on the surface seemed like a great deal. An old large home in a quiet neighborhood, sitting on a street that was peaceful but not far from everything they needed. The price was almost too good to be true, but they didn't mind. It was old, yes, but they loved the charm of it. The high ceilings, the woodwork, and the feeling that they were stepping into a piece of history. They were ready to start their new chapter. Together. The house was far from perfect. There were cracks in the walls. The wooden floors creaked underfoot and the windows were a little drafty. But it had character, and to them that was more important. They knew there would be work to do, but the potential was obvious. It had space, lots of space. The kind of space they had always dreamed of. A big kitchen, rooms that could easily be turned into home offices or guest rooms, and a large, overgrown garden that would need some TLC. It felt like the kind of house where memories could be made. When they first met the previous owner, an elderly woman who had lived in the house for decades, they weren't sure what to expect. She was kind enough, but clearly in a hurry to leave. There was a sadness to her, a weight in her eyes, like she didn't want to let go of the house but knew she had to. It was clear the place meant something to her. And yet there was something about her that made the couple uneasy, even though they couldn't put their finger on it. She spoke of the house with affection but also with caution, as though she was warning them without saying the words. During the final walkthrough, when all the papers had been signed and it was time to hand over the keys, the woman looked them both in the eye. "I hope you enjoy the house," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But there's one thing you need to know. The basement, it's off limits. Don't go down there for your own good, please." The words caught them off guard. They looked at each other, unsure how to respond. The old woman had seemed so normal up until then, but now, standing there in front of them, she had a serious, almost pleading look on her face. She didn't explain further, just repeated, "The basement, don't go down there." And then, as quickly as she had said it, she turned and walked out, leaving them standing on the porch holding the keys to their new life. At first, they thought it was just some old superstition, something the woman believed in because of her age or perhaps her own experiences. The house was old after all. Maybe she was just afraid of the dark, or maybe she had some bad memories tied to the basement. The couple shared a laugh about it. After all, there were no warnings in the official documents about the basement, no mention of any danger. They were free to do what they wanted with the house, and that included exploring every inch of it. Yet despite their rational thoughts, there was something about the warning that stayed with them. It wasn't the kind of thing you could easily forget. The tone of her voice, the way she looked at them, there was a weight behind her words that made them hesitate. Still, they shook it off, deciding it was just another quirk of the old woman, someone who had lived alone for too long. There was nothing to be afraid of. The basement was just a part of the house like any other room. The couple's excitement quickly took over as they began unpacking and settling into their new space. They spent the first few days going through boxes, organizing furniture, and painting the walls. The house began to take shape, turning from a strange, empty shell into something that felt like home. They painted the walls in light colors to make the rooms feel bigger, rearranged furniture several times until it felt right, and started envisioning how they would spend their lives here. Their future was already unfolding before them, and everything felt perfect. But every time they walked past the basement door, they couldn't help but feel a little tug of curiosity. It was a heavy door, unlike any other in the house, and the lock on it looked like it had been there for years. The door itself felt like it was hiding something, as though it was holding a secret, keeping them out for a reason. There was no visible damage to it, but it looked as though it hadn't been opened in a long time. Dust collected in the corners around it, and the wooden frame was slightly warped. They tried not to think about it too much, convincing themselves that the warning had been nothing. The rest of the house was theirs to explore, and they focused their energy on making it their own. Still, every time they passed the basement door, they felt that strange, nagging feeling. Days turned into weeks, and the house slowly started to feel more like theirs. The garden was being cleared, the walls freshly painted, and a new bookshelf was starting to fill with their favorite books. But the basement door remained locked. For a while, they didn't give it much thought. But then, one evening after a long day of work and a couple of glasses of wine, they found themselves standing at the door once again. "I'm going to take a look," one of them said casually. It wasn't said with any real intent, just as a passing thought. "Really? You're going to ignore the warning?" the other one asked, half laughing. But they both knew deep down that they were both thinking the same thing. They were curious. The warning, though, kept them from acting on it for a while. But curiosity was winning, and the thought of a mysterious room in the house became more and more tempting. After a long moment of hesitation, one of them grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox. The lock on the door was old, but it came off with a few careful pries. They both felt a little thrill run through them. The kind you get when you're about to do something you've been told not to do. They had no idea what to expect, but they were ready to find out. With a creak of the old hinges, the door opened. For a moment, nothing happened. The basement was quiet. The air felt colder, heavier, and the darkness seemed to swallow the light from the upstairs hallway. The faint smell of dust and something else, something musty and stale, drifted up. They couldn't quite place it. Slowly, they stepped inside. The stairs leading down were wooden and old, with each step creaking underfoot. They paused at the top of the stairs, trying to get used to the eerie quiet. Their footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, echoing in the empty space. The only sound was the soft drip of water somewhere far below. The basement was as expected, damp, dark, and filled with old furniture. There were covered tables and chairs, along with cardboard boxes stacked neatly in a corner. It was a storage area, nothing more. The kind of basement you would expect to find in an old house. There was nothing unusual about it. Or so they thought. But there was something odd about the walls. Scrawled on the cement in places where it was difficult to make out were strange markings, symbols, almost like someone had carved them in desperation. And in the far corner, an old chest sat covered with dust and cobwebs. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong in such an ordinary basement. They made their way toward it. The air felt thicker, almost like it was pushing them to stay away. The chest was locked, just like the basement door had been. But unlike the door, this lock wasn't old or rusty. It looked new, carefully placed there. They exchanged a look, and for a moment they thought about leaving the chest alone. But the temptation was too strong. One of them tried to open it, but the lock didn't budge. They stood there, staring at it, the weight of their decision sinking in. But there was no going back now. They had ignored the warning, and now they were about to find out why. It had been a few days since they'd broken the lock on the basement door, and still, the strange feeling lingered in the house. After that night, they had gone back to their daily routines, but something was different. The house seemed quieter somehow. The usual sounds of creaking floors and the hum of the refrigerator felt more pronounced, like the house was trying to get their attention. Every now and then, when they walked past the basement door, they couldn't help but glance down at the stairs leading to the dark, mysterious space below. It felt as though the basement was calling them, pulling at their curiosity. But with each passing day, the pull grew stronger. The next weekend, after a long week of unpacking and setting things up, they decided it was time to explore the basement further. The door was still open, the lock broken, and the strange chest in the corner seemed to be waiting for them. The air in the basement felt cooler than anywhere else in the house, and there was something about the shadows down there that didn't sit right. But they had already taken the first step by opening the door, and now they wanted to know more. They had a good reason to go back, curiosity. After all, they were just getting settled into their new life, and if the basement was going to be part of the house, they needed to understand it. They weren't going to let a few old markings and the memory of the previous owner's warning keep them from enjoying their new home. They walked slowly down the stairs again, the faint smell of mildew hanging in the air. The basement was as dim as before, and the shadows from the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should. The chest was still there, sitting untouched in the far corner. But now something felt different. The atmosphere was heavier. There was a tension in the air, as if the house was holding its breath. "I think we should open the chest," one of them said, breaking the silence. The other hesitated, but the curiosity was too strong to resist. They both knew there was something inside that they needed to see. The chest looked even more out of place now, as though it had been waiting for someone to open it. It was old, but in good condition. A dark wood with brass hinges. The lock that had once kept it shut was gone, and they could see the slight gap between the lid and the rest of the chest. It looked harmless enough. With one quick motion, they pulled the chest open. Inside, they found a mix of things, old books, papers, and strange objects wrapped in cloth. But one thing caught their eye immediately: a journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, and the pages inside were yellowed and fragile. It had been hidden away carefully, buried beneath everything else, as if someone had wanted to keep it secret. They both reached for it at the same time. The journal was thick, with pages filled with handwritten notes and drawings. The handwriting was uneven, as though the writer had been in a hurry or struggling with something. There were strange symbols on the margins of almost every page, and some of the pages were stained, as though they had been handled by someone with trembling hands. Without a word, they sat down on an old chair in the basement and began flipping through the pages. As they read, the feeling of unease in the basement grew. The journal didn't tell a simple story. It was more like a collection of notes, ramblings, and half-formed thoughts. The first few pages described the house in vague terms, talking about its age, its history, and its hidden potential, but soon the writing turned darker. The writer spoke of strange experiments, of feelings of being watched, and of a growing sense of dread in the house. There were references to something called the Basement Project, but the details were hazy. The entries became more frantic, as if the writer was struggling to keep his thoughts in order. One of the entries, written in a shaky hand, stood out. "The basement is the key. It has always been the key. I fear what it might unleash if it's disturbed." They stopped reading for a moment, the weight of the words sinking in. It wasn't clear what the writer meant by that, but it was enough to make them feel uncomfortable. They glanced at each other, both of them sensing that the warning had not just been an old superstition. The basement wasn't just off limits for some random reason. There was something else, something much darker at play. The more they read, the more they began to piece together the story. The journal belonged to the previous owner's late husband, a man who had seemed normal to the outside world but had become increasingly obsessed with something in the basement. There were mentions of experiments that were not just scientific but something far stranger. The journal spoke of rituals, of things being done to the human mind, of a place hidden beneath the house that was not meant to be disturbed. But the most unsettling part was that the journal seemed to suggest that the basement was not just a physical space. It was something else, a place where the boundaries between reality and something else had become blurry. The writer described feeling as though he had been pulled into another world, one that was not quite right. There were references to voices, to shadows that seemed to move on their own, and to a growing sense of paranoia. The further they read, the more they felt as though they were diving into a world they shouldn't be in. The last entry in the journal was the most disturbing. It was dated just a few days before the previous owner's husband passed away. The handwriting was nearly illegible, but one phrase stood out. "I've seen it. I've seen what's down there, and I can't leave. I can't go back. It's too late." They both sat in stunned silence, the weight of the words sinking in. The basement was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a dark, menacing place. Whatever had been going on in that space had driven the previous owner's husband to madness, and now they had opened the door. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply sat there, looking at the journal in their hands, trying to process everything they had just read. The quiet in the basement was overwhelming, almost suffocating. The house felt heavier now, like it was alive in a way they hadn't realized before. Eventually, one of them spoke, breaking the silence. "Do you think we should just leave it? Maybe we've disturbed something we shouldn't have." The other didn't answer right away, but stood up, pacing back and forth in the dim light. There was an urgency in their movement, like they needed to figure this out, to make sense of it. "I don't know," they replied finally, "but we can't just pretend this isn't happening. Whatever this is, it's part of the house. It always has been." The air in the basement felt even colder now, and it seemed to thicken with each passing second. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched out longer, as though they were closing in, and the silence became oppressive. The house was holding its breath again, waiting. They didn't know it yet, but opening the journal had marked the beginning of something they couldn't undo. The more they discovered, the more they realized that the house was far from ordinary, and the basement, whatever was hidden there, was no longer just a room. It had become a part of them, a part of the house, a part of something that could not be left behind. With one last glance at the basement door, they decided to go upstairs. They closed the chest carefully, almost reverently, and made their way back to the main floor. They didn't speak on the way up, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The journal was now resting on the table in the living room, its presence a constant reminder of what lay beneath their feet. They had opened the door, but what was waiting for them in the basement was far more than they ever expected. The days after reading the journal passed in a blur. The house, which had once felt so full of promise, now seemed to hold a darker energy. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, felt like it was coming from the basement. The warning from the previous owner, "Don't go down there," echoed in their minds more often than they cared to admit. It was as though the house itself was trying to tell them something, trying to warn them, but they couldn't fully understand what it meant. They kept the journal on the table, but neither of them dared to open it again. The words inside had already shaken them enough, and they weren't sure they wanted to uncover any more of the house's secrets. But still, the basement called to them. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was a need to know, a feeling that something had been set in motion that couldn't be undone. One evening, after a long day of work, they found themselves standing at the top of the basement stairs again. The door at the bottom of the stairs stood open, as if inviting them down. The air was cooler near the basement, as it had been the first time they'd opened it. But tonight something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air that hadn't been there before. "We should go down," one of them said, the words slipping out before they could stop them. It was as if the decision had already been made, even though they hadn't consciously agreed to it. The other looked at them, unsure. The unease in their gut was strong, stronger than it had been before. But the desire to know, to understand what had been left hidden for so long, was overwhelming. They nodded, not saying anything, but both of them knew that the pull of the basement was too powerful to ignore. They descended the stairs slowly, the wood creaking under their weight, each step adding to the tension that hung in the air. The basement felt colder than it ever had, the temperature dropping as they moved deeper into the darkness. They turned on the light at the bottom of the stairs, but it flickered and buzzed as though it was struggling to stay on. It gave the basement an even more unsettling feel, as if the light itself was reluctant to shine on what lay below. They reached the floor of the basement, standing in the thick darkness. The chest was still there, closed, waiting. But now there were other things. The old furniture that had been stored in the basement seemed to have shifted, as though it had been moved around in the night. There were new scratches on the floor, deep and claw-like, that weren't there before. The walls, too, seemed different. The strange symbols that had been lightly etched into the stone were now more visible, like they had been freshened up or scratched deeper. It was as if something had been at work here, something that didn't want them to forget it. The air in the basement felt thicker now, pressing against them, making it harder to breathe. They could hear their own breathing in the silence, loud and panicked. It was as though the house had become aware of their presence, as though it knew they were trespassing. "We need to go back upstairs," one of them said, voice shaky. They reached for the stairs, but when they turned to leave, they froze. There in the corner of the basement was a new sight, an old chair. It was a wooden chair, dark and worn, placed directly in front of the chest. But it wasn't just any chair. There was something deeply unsettling about it. The chair had been positioned as though it was meant for someone to sit in it. The back was straight, rigid, and the seat was worn down as if someone had been sitting there for hours. But the most disturbing thing was the fact that the chair was facing directly toward the chest. It felt like it had been placed there intentionally, as though someone had been watching the chest, waiting for something to happen. They stood there for a long moment, staring at the chair. The basement was so still that it felt like time had stopped. Everything seemed to be waiting, holding its breath. The air grew colder and the hairs on the back of their necks stood up. "We're not alone," one of them whispered. The words came out before they could stop them, and the other person stiffened, their heart racing. They both felt it, the presence, the watching eyes, the sense that something was waiting for them to make a move. The basement felt more alive now, like it had a heartbeat, like it was responding to their fear. The shadows in the corners seemed to move just out of the corner of their eyes. The air seemed to pulse as though the house was breathing with them. It was then that they noticed something else. On the floor near the chest was a pile of papers. Some were old, brittle, and yellowed with age, while others were new, freshly crumpled and torn. They stepped closer, but their feet seemed to move of their own accord. It wasn't just curiosity that pushed them forward now. It was something more, something deeper, a force they couldn't explain. The papers were covered with more symbols, some familiar from the journal, some they had never seen before. The symbols seemed to dance on the paper, shifting and moving as though they were alive. There were drawings, too, of strange figures, some human, some not, that seemed to stare back at them, their eyes hauntingly hollow. One of the papers caught their attention. It was a drawing of the basement, exactly like it was now, with the chair, the chest, and the strange symbols on the walls. But in the corner of the drawing, barely visible, was something else, a figure standing just out of sight. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow, with eyes that seemed to burn through the paper. They couldn't breathe. The image on the paper was too real, too close. It was like someone had drawn the very moment they were living, capturing the exact feeling of being watched. They both felt it then. The cold breath on the back of their necks, the pressure in the air. "We need to leave," the other said, their voice barely above a whisper. But as they turned to run, something stopped them. The basement door, which had been open when they came down, was now shut tight. The handle was turned and the door was locked. They stared at the door in disbelief. It was impossible. They had left it open. It was the only way in and out of the basement. But now it was as if the house itself had sealed them in. Panic set in. They rushed to the door, trying the handle again and again, but it wouldn't budge. The door was locked, trapped from the other side. They turned around in desperation, looking for another way out. But the basement seemed to have changed. The walls were closer now, the shadows more oppressive. The air was thick with a presence, as though the basement was no longer just a room, but a living, breathing entity. And it was angry. "What is this?" One of them gasped, eyes wide. "What's happening?" The room seemed to close in on them. The walls felt like they were moving, shifting. The symbols on the walls glowed faintly, their edges pulsing with an unnatural light. The air was thick, like it was charged with energy, and the temperature had dropped so much that they could see their breath in front of them. They turned to the chest, which now seemed to pulse with energy. The room was alive with the sound of whispers, low, indecipherable voices coming from all directions. The whispers were growing louder, and the presence in the room was becoming overwhelming. Then, as if on cue, the chair in front of the chest began to move. It slid across the floor slowly with a faint scraping sound. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward it, as though the chair itself was pulling the darkness around it. The whispers grew louder, turning into a chant, and then the chest opened. The air seemed to freeze. The room was dead silent all at once. What was inside the chest? What had been waiting for them? They had no time to find out. Before they could move, the light above them flickered and went out. The basement plunged into darkness, and the only thing they could hear was the sound of their own racing hearts. They were not alone anymore. The darkness in the basement seemed to press in on them from all sides. For a moment, neither of them moved, frozen in the oppressive silence that had taken over the room. The flickering of the light was the only thing that broke the stillness, casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. They could still feel the cold air in their lungs, the sharp chill that had crept into the basement, and they knew that something had changed. The room was no longer just a basement, it was something else, something far darker. The chest now open beckoned to them. They had seen it open before, but this time there was no mistaking what it meant. The darkness inside seemed deeper than the shadows around them, a kind of emptiness that was both terrifying and irresistible. It felt as though whatever had been hidden inside was waiting for them to approach, to discover it fully. The whispers had stopped, but the air still hummed with a strange energy, as though the room itself was alive and aware of their presence. The chair that had moved earlier was now back in its original spot, facing the chest as if it had never moved at all. Everything in the basement felt different, unsettling, like it was shifting beneath their feet. Without saying a word, one of them stepped closer to the chest. The other hesitated, eyes darting around the room, feeling the weight of the unseen eyes upon them. The darkness seemed to pull at them, urging them to come closer. There was no going back now. The basement had become their world, and the chest was the heart of it. As they drew closer, a faint scent reached their nostrils. It was musty, like something old and forgotten, mixed with the faintest trace of something burning. It was the smell of decay, of time having eaten away at something hidden and lost. But it wasn't just the smell. It was the sensation of something wrong. The very air around the chest felt thick, as though it had been trapped there for years, waiting for someone to disturb it. The chest itself had a strange aura. The wood, though old, was still strong and solid, but there was something off about it, like it was more than just a container. The edges of the chest seemed to shimmer in the dim light, flickering in and out of focus as though it wasn't quite part of this world. It was as if it had been pulled from another time, another place, and now it was here in their basement waiting for them. When they finally reached the chest, they hesitated. The air around it seemed to grow heavier, thicker, and they could feel the weight of the moment pressing on them. What was inside? What had been locked away for so long? They knew they couldn't turn back now, not after everything they had seen and felt. There was no turning back from this kind of knowledge. With a deep breath, one of them reached out and touched the chest, running their fingers over the rough surface of the wood. It felt strangely warm to the touch, as though it had been heated by some unseen force. The warmth spread up their fingers, through their hand, and into their arm, and for a moment, they thought they could hear something. Whispers again, faint but clear, as if they were coming from the chest itself. The other stepped back, eyes wide as though they could sense the shift in the room. The air felt even colder now, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching toward them like dark fingers. The walls of the basement seemed to close in, the space growing smaller, more confining. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, watching, waiting for them to make their move. Taking a deep breath, the one who had touched the chest slowly began to open it wider. The lid creaked loudly, as if it hadn't been opened in years, and a rush of cold air spilled out from the inside, like a long-held breath being exhaled. The smell that came with it was overwhelming, a mixture of old wood, earth, and something more unsettling, something metallic. It was the scent of something that had been buried for far too long, something that shouldn't be disturbed. Inside, the chest was filled with layers of old cloth, dusty and torn, and at first, they couldn't make out what was hidden beneath it. But as they pushed the cloth aside, they saw something that made their blood run cold. It was a book. The book was old, bound in dark leather that was cracked and worn with age. Its edges were frayed, and the cover was stained with something that looked like dried blood. The pages inside were yellowed, brittle, and the ink on them had faded in many places, but it was still legible, still hauntingly clear. The book seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, as if it was alive, as though it was waiting for someone to open it. They reached out, almost reluctantly, but their hands seemed to move on their own. When their fingers brushed against the cover, they felt a jolt of energy, a shock that ran up their arm and into their chest, making their heart race. It was as though the book had been waiting for this moment, for them to find it, to open it. They hesitated for a long time, standing there in the dim light, staring at the book as if it might suddenly leap out of the chest and consume them. But curiosity, no, it was something more, something that felt like a compulsion, drove them to reach for it. With trembling hands, they lifted the book out of the chest and placed it on the ground in front of them. The basement seemed to grow even colder, the shadows stretching longer as though they were reaching toward the book. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, and for a moment, they wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But it was too late now. They had opened the chest. They had touched the book. And now they had to know what it contained. Slowly, they opened the book, and the pages seemed to turn on their own, as though the book was alive. The pages flickered, revealing strange symbols and diagrams, drawings of the house, of the basement, and of something far darker, something that couldn't be explained in any normal way. The symbols on the pages glowed faintly, just like the ones on the walls of the basement, but these were different. These were older, more ancient, and more powerful. One of the pages caught their eye. It was a drawing of the basement, but the chest in the drawing was open, and inside it was something that wasn't a book. It was a stone, a dark, jagged stone with strange markings on it. The stone was surrounded by a circle of light, and the air around it seemed to shimmer, as if the very fabric of reality was warping around it. As they looked closer, they saw a single word written beneath the drawing: the key. The key. The word resonated in their mind, and suddenly everything seemed to make sense. The basement, the chest, the strange symbols, it was all connected. Whatever was in the basement was part of something much larger, something that they had no way of understanding. But they knew, deep down, that the key was the center of it all. And whatever it was connected to them now, too. The sound of footsteps echoed behind them, but they didn't turn around. The air in the basement had shifted once again. It felt alive, like it was watching them, waiting. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling their ears with words they couldn't understand. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls pressing in on them, the shadows closing in around them. Then a voice, low and almost inaudible, whispered from the darkness, "You shouldn't have opened it." Their hearts froze. The words were clear, spoken in a voice that was not their own, and yet it sounded so familiar, like it was coming from deep within the house itself. They didn't have time to react. The light above them flickered once more, and then the room was plunged into total darkness. The darkness was thick, suffocating. Their hearts pounded in their chests, loud in their ears, and the silence that followed the voice was even more terrifying than the whispers had been. They could feel it. Whatever had been watching them, waiting for them, it was close now. The air in the basement seemed to thicken, heavier than it had ever been, as if the very house itself was holding its breath. But the light, though flickering, was still there. It buzzed and flickered above them, casting weak, wavering shadows across the walls. For a moment they thought they might be trapped in the dark forever. But then with a sudden pop, the light above flickered back on, bathing the basement in its harsh, sickly glow. Their eyes immediately went to the book. It was still open, lying in the middle of the room. But now, the pages had changed. The symbols, those same strange, swirling shapes, had shifted, rearranged themselves into a new pattern. The words were still there, but they were now written in a language they didn't recognize, a language that felt wrong, unnatural. The pages were alive, as if they were speaking to them, urging them to understand something they didn't want to. The whispers were louder now, echoing around them. But this time, it wasn't just the sound. It was the sensation, like fingers brushing against their skin, like a cold hand on the back of their neck, a breath on their ear. It was inescapable. They couldn't ignore it. Suddenly, the temperature in the basement dropped again. It felt like ice was seeping into their bones. The chill was sharp and biting, and they could see their breath fogging in front of them, swirling in the cold air. "We need to leave," one of them said, their voice barely a whisper, but the other didn't respond. They were frozen, staring at the book in the middle of the room, their eyes wide, face pale. Something was pulling them toward it. There was no denying it anymore. The basement wasn't just a room. It was part of something bigger. The book was part of something bigger. And whatever that was, it wasn't letting them go. They could feel it like a chain, invisible but heavy, wrapping around their bodies, holding them in place. But then the book did something that made their blood run cold. The pages turned again by themselves, as if guided by an unseen hand. They could hear the sound of the paper scraping against itself, the soft crinkling noise echoing through the room. The air grew thicker, heavier, and their hearts raced even faster. One page stopped turning. It was marked with more symbols, but these were different. These weren't just drawings. They were instructions. The words, though, in the strange language, seemed to pulse as if they were alive, glowing faintly in the dim light. For a moment, neither of them could move. They didn't want to look at the book, but their eyes were glued to it. There was something there in the writing, something that they both understood without knowing how. The symbols on the page matched the ones in the basement, on the walls, on the floor, on the chest. The drawings of the house, the figures in the shadows, the strange presence that seemed to live in the dark corners. Then a low rumble vibrated through the floor, shaking them to the core. It was deep and unnerving, like the house itself was alive, groaning under the weight of its own secrets. "We have to get out of here," the other whispered again, louder this time, but the words felt hollow, empty. The presence in the room seemed to swallow them, as though the house was refusing to let them go. The door, the one they had entered through, was still locked. There was no way out. The room felt smaller, the walls pressing in closer. The shadows in the corners grew longer, stretching toward them, reaching out like dark, hungry hands. They could feel the basement closing in on them, like the entire house was pushing against them, suffocating them. They needed to get out, but they couldn't move. The weight of the moment was too much. The air was thick and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. They could hear words now, though they were muffled, distorted. Some part of them wanted to understand what the words meant, but another part of them was terrified to know. What if they understood and couldn't escape? The shadows in the room began to shift. The figures that had been moving in the corners of their vision now became clearer. They were not human. They were darker, twisted versions of human shapes, like shadows given form. They moved toward the book, surrounding it, hovering in the corners of the room, their eyes glowing faintly. Without thinking, one of them reached out, grabbing the book with shaking hands. The moment their fingers made contact, A shockwave of energy coursed through their body and they were thrown backward. The force was so strong that they hit the ground hard, their head spinning, their body numb. The room seemed to explode with light. The shadows shrieked, their forms flickering and warping as though they were being pulled apart. The book was glowing now, brighter than anything they had ever seen, its pages flipping rapidly, faster than any human hand could turn them. And then in the center of the room, something appeared. It wasn't a person but a figure, dark, cloaked in shadows, its form impossible to define. It loomed over them, its presence suffocating. They could feel it pressing down on them, a weight so heavy it almost crushed them. They couldn't breathe. The air was thick with the feeling of dread, of something ancient and powerful that had been locked away for too long. The figure reached out, its hands twisting in the air like smoke, and the whispers grew louder, more desperate. "Release it," the figure seemed to say, its voice a low, guttural rasp that reverberated in their bones. "Release the key." The book in their hands began to burn, not with fire, but with a cold, unnatural heat. Like the very essence of the house was turning against them, the pages shimmered, glowing with an otherworldly light. And the words on the pages twisted into something else, something terrible. They had to make a choice. The figure loomed closer, its hands outstretched, and the darkness in the room seemed to close in on them, suffocating. The temperature dropped and they could see their breath again, visible in the freezing air. The shadows that surrounded them were now closing in on the book, on them. They had no choice but to act. With every ounce of strength they had, they threw the book back into the chest. The instant it touched the wood, the basement shook violently. The lights flickered, buzzing, and then everything went black. For a long moment there was nothing, no sound, no movement. Then slowly the lights returned, weak and flickering, casting their sickly glow over the room. The chest was closed again. The room felt different. Empty, hollow, but strangely calm. They stood in the silence, breathless, not knowing what had just happened. Had they escaped? Had they stopped whatever it was that had been waiting for them? The air was still cold, but the oppressive feeling that had filled the room was gone. The whispers were silent now, and the shadows no longer reached for them. They were alone in the basement, the book locked away once again. But they knew one thing: whatever had been in that chest, whatever had been waiting for them, wasn't gone. It was still there, in the house, in the walls, in the shadows, and they both understood that they had only delayed the inevitable. The truth was they had opened something they couldn't close again, and the house had only just begun to reveal its secrets.